Well, I'm afraid you're going to be seeing rather a lot of me today because I shall be introducing quite a few of the talks. The reason is that our organization, RDF, has jointly sponsored a number of scientific talks at this conference together with AAI. The idea, which originally came from Liz Cornwell, who's unfortunately not able to be here, was to bring in some scientists, some high-profile scientists, into this conference because obviously science is a very important part of our worldview. And so they're going to be talking about various aspects of science as it might interest the atheist conference. Among the RDF staff who I want to thank are Josh Timonen, who's doing the camera and does everything to do with and who is the linchpin of our entire organization and has talents too numerous to mention. Mike Cornwell, who's helping here, Maureen Norton, and Andy Thomson, who is one of our trustees and who is our first speaker today. Andy is a psychiatrist with a special interest in evolutionary psychology. He caused quite a sensation, I think, at the first time he spoke at AAI on terrorism. And then he gave an equally well-received talk on why we believe in gods. And today he's going to talk about the difficult problem of morality, taking off from the fact that Francis Collins has used morality as the, bizarrely, in my view, has used morality as his primary reason for actually believing in a supreme being. So, delighted to welcome Andy Thomson.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard. Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for coming to the Early Bird Special. We really appreciate it. It is now about 8:30 on Saturday morning. But for the next few minutes, I want you to imagine something different. I want you to imagine that you are a surgeon. And you're a surgeon who suddenly finds himself in charge of a hospital in the middle of a disaster zone. You have 600 staff, you have 200 critically ill people. It's Monday morning. Monday morning, the electricity goes off. The city's electricity goes off, the water supply goes off. Temperatures rise in your hospital to 100 degrees. Tuesday, the sewer system starts backing up. The helicopters that were taking a few of your patients out are no longer coming. On Wednesday morning, the electrical backup generators that had kicked in on Monday go out. On Wednesday, you have no water, no running water, no electricity, none. Your elevators don't move, stairwells are black, you have no electricity, the temperature in the hospital is now over 100 degrees, sewers are backing up, you're down to about 100 critically ill people. You somehow get through Wednesday. Then on Thursday, you start hearing gunfire. City sheriffs, state police say you have to have the hospital evacuated by 5 p.m. And you have 100 people to deal with, 100 ill patients to deal with. And you're supposed to have them all out of there by 5 o'clock. And there's simply no way you're going to be able to get all of them out of there by 5 o'clock. So what do? You're faced with a number of serious moral questions. How long should healthcare workers have to stay in a hospital if people are going to die? And which of these 100 patients should receive what limited care you have in trying to get them out? The people that you leave who are ill and in pain, where do you draw the line between comfort care and mercy killing? And who's going to make all these decisions? You're in charge. Are you going to make the decision? And when you have to triage these patients, when you have to decide who goes and who stays, how do you make that decision? What's the greatest good here? The number of people you save? The years of life you save? The best quality years? How do you make these decisions? And do you make them alone? Now, some of you may have recognized already that this is not an example from a moral philosophy class. This happened in New Orleans in 2005 at Memorial Hospital. At the last week in August, the first week in September. Now, I'm sure you probably have seen other moral dilemmas and situations that would be embedded in this. And the question is, when you use that moral reasoning to make these decisions, where do those moral capacities come from? Are these moral capacities part of the evolved architecture of your minds? Or are these moral capacities a gift from God? Now, the chief medical officer of the United States, the chief medical scientist of the United States, is Francis Collins. An extraordinary medical scientist, regardless of what you think of his religious beliefs, just a really extraordinary medical scientist. He's known for the Human Genome Project, but he was also responsible for discovering the gene for cystic fibrosis, Huntington's disease, a form of leukemia. And he thinks that these moral capacities that we have are not just a gift from God, they're a sign of God's presence. And many of you may know that he wrote this book, The Language of God, in 2006, a bestseller. And in it, he argues that what he calls the moral law is a sign of God's presence. And he seems to have been heavily influenced by C.S. Lewis. And the idea is that an architect can't be a wall in the house that he or she builds. Similarly, God can't just be here, so he's got to leave some sign. And in his view, the sign, one of the signs, the two signs, is the moral law. And what Collins means by the moral law, two things. One, our capacity for altruism. And secondly, what he calls the law of right behavior, which is our ability to understand the difference between right and wrong. And he's very explicit that in his view, altruism simply cannot be explained by selfish gene theory. And in point of fact, he sees it as a scandal. Simply can't explain it that way. But he leaves the door open. And he says that if it can be shown that there is some Darwinian advantage to the moral law, then this idea of the moral law being a signpost from God is in trouble. And so what I would like to do this morning with you is let's take up Dr. Collins' challenge and let's look and see if we have evidence, good evidence for a Darwinian explanation for altruism and our capacities to tell the difference between right and wrong. But before I do that, I too want to thank a number of people. And I'd like to start with Bobby Kirkhart, Stuart Beckman, the people from AAI who put on this conference. I think it's already marvelous. I can't wait for the rest of the day. Thank you, Bob Neary. Everybody knows, stand up, Bobby, come on. Is Stuart here? Any of the other organizers here? Thank you so much. I too want to thank the staff from the Richard Dawkins Foundation, Robin Cornwell, Maureen Norton, Mike Cornwell, and I particularly want to thank this man behind the camera. This is the gentleman to whom Richard's new book is dedicated, Josh Timonen. How many of you saw the baloney detection kit on the website? How many of you saw that? Isn't that marvelous? Isn't that marvelous? I use that every day when I watch Fox News. I mean, but I think it just shows you some of, I think, his talents, the staff at the table, and I particularly want to thank Richard Dawkins. I mean, for his Thank you, Richard. For his work, for the opportunity to work with the foundation, it's been one of the great privileges of my life. All right, let's take up Dr. Collins' challenge. And where do we start? And we start, I think, in 1964 with Bill Hamilton. And Hamilton showed that you could evolve altruism. You could evolve kin altruism. Genes that are in bodies that have altruistic behavior towards other bodies with copies of that gene would proliferate. And he came up with Hamilton's rule, the famous Hamilton's rule, that the cost to the fitness of the altruist, if it's less than the benefit to the receiver discounted by the degree of relatedness, altruistic behavior will evolve. Then in 1971, Robert Trivers built on this and showed that reciprocal altruism can evolve. I'll scratch your back if later, when you need it, if later you'll scratch mine when I need it. And Trivers showed, I think, how some of our emotions are really functional in that they help motivate and mediate this reciprocal altruism. We start to get insight into the function of our emotions. And of course, this was brought to a wider world and continues to be brought to a wider world by Richard's wonderful book, The Selfish Gene. And there's just an extraordinary amount of research that has exploded from these ideas. And one I particularly like, it came relatively late, what I call Steve Pinker's postscript. And he makes the argument that one of the other selection pressures that will drive reciprocity for creatures like ourselves is that human cooperation, there's no zero-sum game, that the benefits of cooperation are just so extraordinary. And secondly, that rationality itself precludes any sort of egocentric view. That if I ask you to do something for me, automatically I am having to take into account your perspective. And so that right there is probably one of the bases for the golden rule, that you simply can't be, in some sense, really selfish and rational. And then, as I said, it's had an enormous impact on research, and we have a lot of what I would argue good ideas with empirical support. This is just some of them. And of course, one of the controversies that's generated by this issue is the issue of group selection. And I would argue to Dr. Collins that I think the evidence is there. And I think most biologists, evolutionary psychologists would argue that the evidence is there, that we do pursue our ultimate genetic self-interest through proximate evolved mechanisms that give us a genuine concern for, a true concern for other people. So at least on the first prong of Dr. Collins' argument, I would submit to him, if he ever watches this video, that if he looks at the evidence, I think it's there. Now, let's look at the second prong of Dr. Collins, the question of right and wrong. And what constitutes right behavior, what constitutes wrong behavior. And this has been a debate among the moral philosophers, and right behavior, according to Kant, was duty, was obligations. You don't hurt somebody, period. Rights and obligations. And the other view was Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, and that right behavior was determined on the consequences, on the utility of the behavior. So that's the ultimate judgment of right behavior, wrong behavior. What I hope to show you this morning is that they were onto something. In some sense, they were both right, and they were both right, and the evidence is in our brains. We have Kant part of our brains, and Bentham Mill parts of our brain. Now, if you've not seen this problem, have some recognition for the problem, all right? For those of you who don't recognize the problem, and even those who do, I want to give you the trolley problem. Now, imagine that you're out for a walk, and suddenly you see a runaway trolley. The driver's slumped over the steering mechanism, and that trolley is headed down a track, and you can see that it's going to kill 5 unsuspecting workmen. And you're there, and there's a switch, and if you push the switch, it'll divert the trolley down a side track, but there's another workman down there, and he will be killed. Now, how many of you think it's permissible or it's the right behavior to push that switch? Okay, pretty quick. All right. What? I didn't hear? Oh, sorry, no, chime in if you got a good comment. Don't hesitate, come on. You lost sleep over this? Okay. Well, I'm going to show you in a minute which part of his brain kept him awake. Seriously. All right, now, second problem is called the footbridge problem. And it's the same sort of thing. You're walking on you're on a footbridge crossing a trolley track, and you see a runaway trolley again. The driver slumped over the steering mechanism, and it's headed down the track, and there are 5 workmen that are going to be killed. And there's this big man next to you with a big knapsack on, and if you push him down to his death, he'll stop the trolley, and he'll keep the 5 guys from being killed. Okay, now, I know what you're thinking. No, you can't jump, okay? You've got to push the guy to solve this problem. And the guy is not Jerry Falwell. All right? Okay. So now, how many of you think it's morally permissible, it's the right behavior to push the man off the footbridge? Okay. Now, you will notice that very few people raised their hand, and those that did, it took a second. Took a second. Step back, it's the exact same problem. You are sacrificing 1 life to save 5. Absolutely same problem. But there's a dramatic difference in people's responses. And not just in, not just sophomores in college. I mean, this has been done on the web in various cultures all over the world, and the problem changed to fit the culture. And it's uniform, that the trolley response, people think it's morally acceptable, but harming the man is not acceptable, or if it is, it takes a while to do that. And Joshua Green, a neuroscientist, decided to put people in functional MRIs and give them these problems. And it, I think, will become a classic paper in Science in 2001. And what he showed was that very specific areas of the brain light up when given these problems across the board. And this doesn't show it very well. I want to use a slide from one of his other papers, which I think illustrates it. And to orient you here, this is a brain, obviously. This is the frontal area of the brain, right here, frontal area of the brain. And we're looking at, this is dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. We're looking at a brain here. Imagine, my head has sort of been split, and you're looking at my left half of the brain. And this is the midline. And this is sort of underneath, right here. This is the frontal lobes, and this is underneath. And I didn't know how I was going to illustrate it, so I want to thank Gary Edwards, the omelet chef in the kitchen, for helping me with this. And again, because I want you to get an idea of this. And so imagine that this is your brain. And so this is the frontal lobe, right here. Frontal lobe, top sulcus, frontal lobe. And we're talking about the area right here. Dorsal, top, lateral, prefrontal cortex, right here. And then this area, the ventral, medial, underneath ventral, medial on the midline, prefrontal cortex. And see if we can. All right, so let's see, I'll keep it in line with the slides. So we got left half of the brain. So dorsal lateral prefrontal cortex right here, medial prefrontal cortex inside. And it turns out that what happens is that when you have that first problem, the trolley problem, that you make the decision pretty quickly, what lights up is your dorsal lateral prefrontal cortex. And this is the area of your brain that makes calculations, cost-benefit analysis, decides, on phone numbers, and it's one of the later evolved areas of our brain that's in cost-benefit decision-making, and it also will have some control over the medial part. Now, when you have to do the push the guy from the bridge, it's a completely different story. What lights up in your brain is this medial prefrontal cortex, and that's the area of our social emotions, our social connections, our feelings, particularly our social feelings. And what I'll show you is our moral feelings, right here. Okay, that's an older part of our brain. And that lights up, don't hurt the guy. But our dorsal lateral prefrontal cortex is saying, save 5 lives at the cost of 1. And it creates a conflict. And what mediates the conflict is this area of the brain that you see marked ACC. It's not the basketball league. It is the anterior cingulate cortex. And that mediates the conflict. And what Green showed was that when you had the trolley problem, everybody does it quickly. You saw all the hands go up here. And when all those hands were going up, if you had not seen the problem before, you were operating on dorsal lateral prefrontal cortex. When I gave you the second problem, and there was that pause, 2 areas of your brain going. That ventral medial part is lighting up saying, can't hurt the guy, wrong, bad, can't do that. And the dorsal lateral prefrontal cortex is saying, well, wait a second. Hold on, save 5 lives, and at the cost of 1. And the ACC was mediating the conflict, and a couple people, slowly put their hand up and said it would be permissible. And that's what's found in the studies. But stand up and tell. No, this is important. This is part of my talk. Really, stand and tell, seriously.
The guy in the second example wasn't a worker on the track, so he didn't seem to me to be incurring the risk of working on a track, whereas where you had the 5 and the 1 worker was still working on a track where a train could run over him. So that seemed to be leveling the playing field.
Okay. What he may be illustrating there is that, what I'll show you is that that's sort of a secondary rationalization, that you're trying to come up with explanations to cope with that feeling underneath, that moral feeling, the details of which you can't really be conscious of, that just kick in, and that it's a sort of secondary trying to rationalize, think it through, to deal with it. And that's the ACC lighting up, basically. They put psychopaths in fMRIs, and what they show there is the psychopath, as you would predict, just makes utilitarian decisions. The moral emotions don't kick in. What has been found is that we have these moral emotions which seem to get triggered in 5 different domains. First domain is harm care. Don't harm anybody. Don't push this guy off the footbridge. The second is reciprocity fairness. Triggers our sense of fair, not fair. Authority, hierarchy. We live in a complex social world with social hierarchies that we have to negotiate, and emotions trigger our behavior in those conflicts. Community and coalitions, in-group, out-group. For those of you that saw P.Z. Myers' lecture yesterday, remember when he was talking about when he goes to these meetings and they introduce him as P.Z. Myers the atheist. And what's getting triggered there is they say, this is P.Z. Myers the atheist, and so what kicks in around everybody else in the room is, out-group, bad, withdraw. And the algorithm in this is your moral emotions. The basic algorithm is positive, approach, negative, withdraw. And we are biased towards the negative because for survival, the world is full of far more dangers than opportunities. And so there's a negative bias in that algorithm. So these are the 5 domains which can get triggered, and then our moral emotions, I mean, guilt and shame can operate in all of these. But these are the 5 domains. And if you think about it, these moral emotions get turned on or off very quickly, just on a hair trigger. If you think about something right now, if you in your mind think about something that is really morally outrageous to you, I mean, try it. I mean, if you just do it, just a thought experiment, try doing that. And if you pay attention to your body, you can just instantly feel that kick in. Okay, it's an automatic response. This is, I think, a nice definition of these moral emotions. It's an evaluative feeling. It's an evaluative feeling, an automatic evaluative feeling that kicks in with really no conscious awareness. It's automatic. It's fast, it's automatic, boom. Now, if you take 6-month-old children, 6 to 10-month-old children, and you show them a puppet show in which a puppet is climbing up a mountain, and another puppet helps the climber up the mountain, and then you show a different puppet show where the climber is going up the mountain, and there's someone at the top, another puppet at the top of the mountain that knocks him off, a 6-month-old infant will orient towards the helping puppet. And this is, I think, crucial research. It shows that these abilities to make social evaluative distinctions are hardwired, inborn, and start showing up at 6 months, 10 months of age. You can demonstrate this. And I think it, again, shows that it's hardwired, this capacity for social evaluative judgments. It's unlearned. It's part of human nature. And it also shows the basis of all moral decisions, which is something positive, move towards it, something negative, back away. Now, how do we understand these moral emotions, this automatic process? And I think there are various ways of looking at it. Mark Hauser thinks that it is basically like Chomsky's deep grammar, that this is a deep moral grammar that's in our brains, and then our own development and culture shapes how we use it and how we apply it in those 5 different domains. And you remember one of those domains was authority. So in the Islamic world, you don't draw a cartoon of Muhammad. And we think that's nuts. I still think it's nuts, but you can see where that moral emotion could come from, that automatic, fierce response, if that culture has ingrained that authority mechanism with your moral emotions. Moral reasoning is really that prefrontal, that lateral prefrontal cortex, and that's where we take in information and try to grind over it and think about it and make a moral decision. But what is now clear from the research is that our moral capacities are different. The judgment capacity is an automatic emotional response, and the justification process is a cortical, later cognitive process. And I think one of my favorite analogies on this is that your moral reasoning ability, that lateral prefrontal cortex, is like a lawyer who does his or her bidding for the client, and the client is those moral emotions, and represents those moral emotions up to a certain point. If the moral emotion is just really out of line, our moral reasoning capacity can suppress it and not go along with it. And I think this is a very nice way of conceptualizing something that's obviously deep neurobiologic structure. Where does this leave us? Well, it leaves all of us as what Tedlock calls intuitive politicians and intuitive prosecutors. And just think about it. We use our moral sense at times to, as I said, to play to various constituencies, whether we like it or not. Our moral reasoning is shaped by these moral emotions, which are shaped by who our allies are, and similarly our intuitive prosecutors. My comment about Jerry Falwell drew laughs. I mean, I don't like Jerry Falwell, but there are others who do, and I'm amidst my allies. And if you just think about, how you use your morality, this idea that Collins has that we have this fixed idea of right and wrong, I think we now have very good evidence that that is not the case. I think we have to be humble before the facts. And the facts are that our sense of right and wrong is a little bit more flexible than we care to believe, and is impacted by strong moral emotions that we have some conscious awareness of and control of. But they shift. Now, since part of this conference is to celebrate Darwin's legacy, I want to just take a little detour and show you something about where Darwin's idea, not just of natural selection, but his idea of sexual selection, comes into play in understanding our morality. And Darwin himself thought that our moral virtues might be a sexually selected trait. He really had the idea first. And I think most of you know about sexual selection. The classic example is the female peahen chooses the male peacock with the biggest, brightest tail. And the idea here is that our peacock's tail may be our mind, our brain. This is Shakespeare. But our wit, our humor, our creativity may be, to a large extent, a sexually selected trait. And one of my favorite evolutionary psychologists, Geoffrey Miller, has a paper which I recommend to you in the Quarterly Review of Biology. I think it's June of 2007, and he lays out the case that many of our moral capacities actually were shaped by sexual selection. If you think about it, kindness, empathy, he postulates the idea that courtship is a moral minefield, I think are his words. And I put the conscientiousness and agreeableness in italics because those that know psychology, there are 5 basic personality variables, the big 5, in all of us. I mean, personality can be broken down to 5 dimensions, and 2 of them are conscientiousness and agreeableness, and we're all somewhere in a spectrum there, and he makes the argument that those are, of course, moral virtues or moral traits, and lays out the evidence for sexual selection. Often the question is raised about morality, precursors of morality in animals. And I'd like to just, again, another brief diversion here to raise a question. We know that, for instance, elephants can be altruistic, they have concern for others, they will, help other elephants. Dolphins have an awareness of other dolphins and will, engage in behaviors that we would call altruistic or sacrificing or punishing. And of course, our cousins. And the idea here has always been, well, that's pro-social behavior. But wait a second. If we're saying that altruism, punishment, selflessness, all these things are part of our morality, and we see them in other animals, why wouldn't we call it moral behavior in those animals? And the idea that these are precursors of human morality, I would submit to you as one view, is a view that's influenced by human vanity and narcissism, because these animals are as equally as evolved as we are, and they may have moral systems that evolved to solve the particular problems in their complex social worlds. And this is an idea that is, if you're interested in this, Beckhoff and Pierce have an interesting new book called Wild Justice that lays out the evidence for this. So, what's the new synthesis on this? And the new synthesis from the research is, again, that it is these moral emotions, these moral intuitive emotions, that have primacy in our judgments. They don't dictate it absolutely, but they have primacy. And the idea that morality is content of things, rights, duties, obligations, no, that moral thinking is social doing, that morality is part of the adaptations to deal with our complex social world, that morality builds and binds. It's utterly crucial to living in a complex social species. Let's finish with, or almost finish with Dr. Collins again. If you look in his book, even though at the beginning he sort of opens the door, unfortunately he has this statement, which I think, again, sort of closes the door a bit. He says that even if he had evidence overwhelming evidence, he still would not budge. That's how I read it. And I would submit to him, obviously, that I think we do have overwhelming evidence. Just one example, the psychopath that we showed you. We now know that that's heritable. There's no question but psychopathy, has a real genetic basis to it. There's just no question about it. You can show the heritability, and that clearly has influence on moral behavior. And we understand through free rider problems how psychopathy can evolve. Let me finish with, let's go back to New Orleans and we'll finish there. On September 11th, when they got back to the hospital, there were 45 bodies in the chapel. As people had been dying, they had moved them into the chapel. But on the last day, when they got most people out, there were some others that were put in there at the end. 17 of them. And the autopsies showed that quite a few of them had massive doses of morphine and midazolam, a Valium-like drug. Massive doses. Doses that would be lethal. And the Attorney General of Louisiana opened an investigation. And in Louisiana, as most places, a coroner has to rule that the evidence suggests homicide. And the New Orleans coroner, Dr. Frank Minyard, who had been in the midst of Katrina, agonized over this. And he consulted a lot of experts. And he agonized over the decision. And one of the things that influenced him was the medical ethical dictum that the goal of a physician's treatment should never be a patient's death. And he was particularly troubled by one death, that of a man, Emmett Everett, who was still on Thursday awake. He did not have an illness where death would be anytime soon. And in looking at the medical records of many of those 17 people, it was clear that a lot of them had medical illnesses that would not have ended in death. They had survived an awful 3-day ordeal. And so Dr. Minyard ultimately put forward, I think, 4 charges of homicide against second-degree murder, against the surgeon that we talked about, and 2 nurses, the physician, Dr. Anna Poe, and 2 of the nurses. The local, remember the charges were first pressed by the state attorney general. There were allegations this was politics. The local district attorneys who had to present the case were not enthusiastic. So they clearly had moral judgments about what had happened. And let's give him, his due. The attorney general may have had his moral judgments about what was right or wrong. And clearly Frank Minyard had reached a conclusion. But these local district attorneys, really weren't enthusiastic about it. So they went ahead and presented evidence to the grand jury. But it's questionable how much of the evidence the grand jury heard. That's secret. What we know is the grand jury, who was made up of people who had survived Katrina, had been in New Orleans and had survived Katrina, people on the grand jury would not return an indictment against Dr. Poe and the 2 nurses. The story doesn't end there, because the families of some of these survivors have now brought wrongful death suits. And so these are still going through the courts. And I think we'll hear more about it. So that you can see that the people of New Orleans still face some very agonizing moral dilemmas. Now, when they face those moral dilemmas and try to think through them, or when we face moral dilemmas and try to think through them, what is better? That we think that these moral capacities we have are a gift from God, and we know absolute right from wrong, Or is it better that when we think about our moral dilemmas and making decisions, that we realize that our moral capacities are not as fixed right and wrong as we would like to think, that they show a flexibility and a complexity that is a legacy of our evolution, which is now in our neurobiology. And is it better to be aware of that and to know that we can be quite biased, very biased, much more than we're consciously aware of? Which way is better to think about our moral dilemmas? You be the judge. Thank you very much.
This is further to the Katrina dilemma, which we all observed. What would people think had the medical professionals abandoned their posts, left the people in the hospital to their whatever happened to them, and saved themselves rather than some being accused of perhaps committing murder?
Did everybody hear the question? Okay. I don't, the answer to the question, the question is what would have happened if the medical professionals had stayed there? I don't think that would have happened. But again, put yourself in the place of those medical professionals. You're being ordered by the authorities to evacuate the hospital and leave. Do you submit to that authority, or do you say, I don't care what's going to happen, I'm going to stay? And you have to remember, on Thursday, when that decision would have been made, you don't know if your hospital is going to be flooded, or, you're hearing gunfire. You don't know that the waters will soon recede, and helicopters would have been available maybe Thursday, Friday. You don't know. So I like to think, but we always think of ourselves as more moral and other people as less moral. That's one of our biases. And of course, I like to think I would have stayed. But, as they say, excuse me, there but for the grace of God I wasn't there. But I think it's a very tough question.
Thanks very much for your talk. I'm wondering, you mentioned that the psychopath is inherited to some degree?
Yes, you can map out the heritability, yes.
And that sexual selection is a key thing for the various attributes. So is it disappointingly possible that certain religious groups that are very authoritarian, that they'll select for that authoritarian thing, and so that will propagate in those populations?
Do religions breed psychopaths? The propensity to follow authority. Separate from that, there is some research that is starting to show genetic variation that has to do with submission to authority versus not. And it's actually, I think, on the genes for the serotonin allele that Prozac touches. So some of the genetics of that are known. Now, your question of whether certain religions would breed psychopaths, of course, I'm among friends, so I'd like to think yes. But I don't think necessarily so. The evolution of psychopaths is thought to be this complicated frequency-dependent model in groups, and I think it would be stretching it to make that argument, as much as we'd like to.
It was a great talk. When faced with the second part of the trolley problem, my mind went to, I'm actually skeptical whether or not the big guy would really stop the trolley. And so I'm faced with a dilemma that I feel that the trolley wouldn't actually stop. We might actually end up with 6 deaths instead of just 1. And I realize the way the problem's presented, it's going to stop the trolley. But my brain's like telling me, well, in real life, I don't think that would really happen. And so I'm kind of curious whether any of that's been explored in the studies or not.
Yes, and what I think Green and his researchers would say would be that when you're going, well, the guy really wouldn't stop the trolley. That again is a sort of secondary justification to try to justify your emotional, moral response of don't hurt the guy. You know, don't hurt the guy, and then you need to justify it, so your mind is going, well, you know, he really wouldn't stop it. And you're not conscious of that. You don't know the roots of that initial response. It's just a gut feeling, don't hurt the guy. And then your lawyer, that lawyer interpreter in your lateral cortex is going, well, the guy really wouldn't kill him, and so you're justifying that initial gut response. That's my understanding of the explanation.
Thank you. The evolution of man, for most part, has been tribal situations, small groups of people that are interdependent upon each other. The last 150 years or so, our society, at least here in America, has been around an industrialization where our local community is not really what we bond to, it's our workplace. And that the morality of the workplace is less than ideal for perpetuation of any justice or anything else. Are we, similar to the question about the religion breeding psychopaths, is our industrial society going to begin to morph into psychopaths where people who make the money because they make the bad deals become more sexually attractive because they've got fancy cars and so on? I mean, are we going down a moral bad slope here?
I think you raise a number of excellent points. Keep in mind that up until the year 1500 AD, 2/3 of the world were still small hunter-gatherer tribes. I mean, and that's the environment we evolved in. And one of the explanations for the trolley problem is exactly that. It's a mismatch between the modern world and the world that we evolved in, because in the ancient world, you wouldn't have had that, because the only thing you would have had would be the don't push the guy. You do no harm. That gut feeling. And so the trolley problem is a manifestation of the mismatch between the environment we evolved in and the environment that we now are in, where we can just do a cost-benefit without the moral emotion really kicking in. So that's the first part. The second part about the evolution of psychopathy, I don't know the numbers, but there is actually a fascinating study. There's a famous psychologist, Hare, who developed what's called the psychopathy checklist, the PCLR. And it is very accurate in diagnosing psychopaths. And one of the questions has always been, do psychopaths always end up in jail? Well, no, there was research that suggested they did. It was very hard to find them. And then a group went and buried the PCLR in this long questionnaire and gave it to some executives in Fortune 500 companies. And so it's a classic social psychology experiment where you're just asked to do a questionnaire about business, and buried in, you don't know you're being checked out to see if you're a psychopath. And they gave it, and I don't remember the percentages, but there was a significant percentage of those executives that were psychopaths according to Hare's checklist. It's in a book. If you look under Robert Hare, and it's co-authored, and I don't remember the title, but is the question of they proliferate? I don't know, but do they end up in top positions? Absolutely.
I think we better just have
two more questions, and I'll two things. I'm glad to stay around, and also anybody that would like my slides, if you've got a flash drive, you're more than welcome to them. Yes.
This wasn't my original question, but I happen to work on Bay Street in Canada, which is the equivalent of Wall Street in New York. I can guarantee you're right. There's a lot of psychopaths running brokerage firms. My question was to do with the first trolley car example. Most people in the room chose to save the one person, kill the one person.
Yeah, but that's slip. That's what you'd like.
However, I'm guessing the results would change if that one person was known to the decider. If it was a friend or a relative, it would invert the decision dramatically?
Yes, and they do research that. I mean, those are variations. Those are one of the variations of the trolley problem, where you know the person that would be killed, and if you push the switch. And I don't know the results of that. I don't know the percentages, but that's out there.
With our favorite people, the Catholic priests, is the brain being what is our minds and our consciousness, does the repetitive exposure to this kind of temptation that we know is morally wrong, because I'm assuming that most of them would say it's morally wrong and not that all of them would be psychopaths, is the repetitive exposure exhausting this neurological chemical pathway to where it no longer functions appropriately?
The question is, does repetitive exposure exhaust the pathway where it no longer functions appropriately? And using the example of Catholic priests who are pedophiles. I don't think it exhausts the pathway. Actually, one of Joshua Green's latest pieces of research is where they are putting people in functional MRIs and having them make moral choices when the temptation is present or the temptation is not present, and seeing what happens in the brain. And my memory of that paper is that when the temptation is present, you're more likely to do it. The temptation actually makes it harder to suppress the immoral act, I think. But if you look up Joshua Green, I think it's Pushing Our Moral Button, something like that, they're researching that. I think, excuse me?
Snakes in Suits.
Oh yes, the Hare book is called Snakes and Suits. Thank you very much about the executives. Snakes and Suits, thank you. Again, thank you very much for coming in early. Thank you very much.